a beautiful night in the hood. It's a beautiful night in the hood. Gonna be hanging out in the hood.
Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball.
There have been many players in baseball history that have switched positions in order to make it in Major League Baseball. And there are a lot of stories about players that before they got to the major leagues switched positions. We hear about Kenley Jansen of the Dodgers was a catcher, and if you watch the guy pitch, he kind of has a catcher's
he kind of throws it like a catcher
from his ear. He throws it. So Stan Musial famously ran into the fence. And he was a pitcher, but he was playing the outfield, ran into the fence and hurt his shoulder. And the guy gets at the bat and he goes, "What does he do?" He's a pitcher. And he watched him hit and he goes, "That man's not a pitcher. That man's a hitter." And so he didn't pitch anymore after he hurt his shoulder. Mark McGwire was a pitcher at USC.
And it's not surprising that a lot of the best players, especially, as they came up through the system, were pitchers, because generally the best hitter on your team is going to, when you're growing up and you're playing, youth baseball, the best hitter on your team is probably going to be the best player.
That kid in your little league team.
Yeah, who was just he was better than everybody else, right. So he did all the pitching and he was the best hitter. There's always one.
And I didn't know that Ted Williams even pitched as late as minor league baseball, which is, hard to believe. There goes the greatest hitter I ever saw. And so what we wanted to do is look at players that had a significant time pitching and hitting. And so the first criteria we used was the number of batters faced if you're going to be a hitter, right? Well, and you pitch for a while. We have a zillion guys out there, even this season, who, pitch to a few hitters. And, you can see how somebody over the course of their career could pitch to, 10 or 20 hitters if they're getting in mop-up.
Even if you had a guy that came in and once a season over the course of 15 years pitched in some throwaway blowout game.
Right.
He could rack up 60, 70 batters over the course of his career, but you would never think of him as a pitcher.
But, most people think, and obviously Shohei Ohtani is rewriting the whole
Well, that's what makes Ohtani so
record
interesting.
book.
He's actually doing it.
Right,
He's
right.
actually being a pitcher and a hitter.
It's simultaneous. Because a lot of these guys, when we talk about Babe Ruth, when he came up, right, he was probably the most famous early guy that we can remember, right? He came up as a pitcher, has the all-time World Series record for, ERA, but it did face 4,896 hitters. That's, significant.
You didn't accidentally face those guys. You were a pitcher.
So, but the all-time leader is another guy who's an almost guy, and you probably haven't heard of him because he started pitching before 1900, a guy named Kid Gleason, which is a pretty cool name.
It is a cool name. Never heard of him.
So he had 10,000 plus batters faced. He has the most all time, 10,600 or so.
It's a lot of batters.
Right. He had 8,200 plate appearances. So think about that. Again, at this time, players did this.
You were going to play both ways. You weren't just a pitcher.
It wasn't that unusual for a guy to do that. But the further along you go, you get to Babe Ruth's time. He was somewhat unusual. Another Hall of Famer at the time, Sam Rice, pitched his first 2 years in the major leagues in 1915 and 16 before he went on to have a Hall of Fame career with the Reds as an outfielder.
So you would expect to find a lot more of these guys in sort of what we would refer to as classic or historical baseball, where it was a lot more common to have these guys that sort of operated as full two-way players, where Ohtani is the first guy to operate as a full two-way player in 50 plus years.
Right. And you go back to guys like Babe Ruth, and who was the last guy who significantly did that. Lefty O'Doul, and I'll always finally remember going to Lefty O'Doul's bar in San Francisco, and a testament to his baseball career with all kinds of cool baseball stuff around. Lefty O'Doul has a lifetime average of 349. But he did pitch to 372 major league hitters. And to give you any context, a pitcher in an average game might pitch to 30 if he pitches in the old days, you'd pitch almost the whole game a lot of the time. So 30 batters maybe.
So he, 10 plus starts.
Yeah. And
if
so,
he was a reliever, he wouldn't have been in as much.
So he floundered, though, as a pitcher, and he took 5 years off. He comes back off at age 31 as an outfielder, and he hits 349, the fourth highest career average of all time. Not a Hall of Famer. Should have just been a hitter. Would have got there sooner, he wouldn't be an almost guy, and that's really where he is. And here's a guy who probably, could be a guy included in the Hall of Fame. Mm-hmm. How about a guy named Rube Bressler, which, again, you want to stay in the game.
You say Rube?
Rube.
Oh, man, his parents must have been angry.
That was a name a lot, and that's had a coach named Rube Walker back in '69. So Rube was a name; it wasn't meant you're a bumpkin necessarily. It wasn't in the same context. But he had a good rookie season for the A's in 1914, the Philadelphia A's, and he just kept getting hurt. So he went out and he finally says, well, I tried hitting. Why not? Other guys could hit. Why not me? He played 12 seasons, hit .301 for his career, and had a really nice career. WAR of 20.3, but not enough to get you into Cooperstown. That's for
it's
sure.
just interesting that he was a good enough. Like it makes sense though that you had these guys that they were the best player at the time, less because they were the best at a baseball player. Well, he's probably just the best athlete.
Yeah, and just trying to find a way to be a professional baseball player, I think, is what it is more than it is. I just, whatever it takes.
You got to have that drive to want to go through with it, especially back when he was doing it.
And so there aren't, Smokey Joe Wood, right? If you ever watched 8 Men Out, he's one of the guys that 8 Men Out and the Field of Dreams. He comes out of the cornfield. The whole thing. He was called the Rick Ankiel, which we'll talk about. I'll let you talk about Rick Ankiel of his time. He went 34-5 for the World Series Red Sox in 1912.
So
34-5.
Right now, that feels like that's a bit of an insult to call him the Rick Ankiel, historical Rick Ankiel, because Rick Ankiel was never that good.
I think that's true. But his arm, like in the case of Rube Bressler, he gets hurt. And so then he becomes an outfielder with Cleveland, and he plays 5 seasons in the field, and he hit .297 for his career. He had 5,653 batters faced and 2,282 plate appearances.
So that's impressive to me because that means he was clearly used as a player that did a lot of both, like more so than the other guy that we just talked about.
Bressler.
No, O'Doul.
Oh, Lefty O'Doul.
Because he only faced like 300 batters.
That's fair. That's fair.
5,600 batters, you were a pitcher.
Yeah. Big difference there. So why don't you talk about the famed Rick Ankiel, who's most people's modern day, guy did both things.
Well, I remember when Rick Ankiel came up, I think it was in 99, where he was a phenom rookie for the Cardinals, really good his first year, really good his second year. And I remember in the 01 playoffs, Rick Ankiel forgot how to throw a baseball
really
anywhere
weird.
in the vicinity of the plate.
That was
and
weird.
if you've never seen it, you need to go back and watch it because I've never seen a pitcher get a case of the yips like this. Where like the only thing that I can think that it was comparable to was something else that was happening around the same time with Knobloch's inability to throw the ball to first base. Chuck Knobloch was the Yankees second baseman, and both him and Ankiel, it was like they forgot how to throw. Ankiel would throw the ball 5 feet over the catcher's head to like the left of home plate. And like I remember his catcher like looking at him like, what is going on?
So you're a good Met fan. So if I said Mackie Sasser, what would you remember anything about that name?
No.
So Mackie Sasser was a backup catcher for the Mets, and he had a problem throwing the ball back to the pitcher. So he would throw it. He would fake it. He'd fake it. He'd fake it. And finally, he realized the best way for him to do was to throw the ball as hard as he could at the pitcher, which didn't throw the pitcher very much, but at least he could get it to the guy without throwing it into center
It's
field.
like my shortstop in high school who just would drill the ball back at you as hard as he can from when you're getting it like thrown around after a strikeout. You're like, dude, I'm trying to focus on the next batter, not defend myself for my life. You do not need to uncork a hot one.
Another guy who had an arm that was good enough to be a pitcher's arm was Sean Dunston, and he played for the Cubs. And Mark Grace, his first baseman, would scream at him because Dunston would peg the ball as hard as he could to first base. Stop doing that!
It's annoying. Let me just tell you, if there is anybody out here that has like young kids in baseball, I understand the idea of like throw it as hard as you can every single time. But when your second baseman is fielding a soft ground ball and you as the pitcher are running over to cover first base, you don't need him showing off his arm strength on a 10-foot throw. Adds a little bit layer of nervousness to it. Just, get it there nice and accurate.
So Ankiel, as you're talking about in that playoff, he went all nuke lelouch because he started throwing balls into the backstop on the fly.
On the fly, that's the thing. Bouncing ball, like completely lost it, never regained it again.
Right. And so you feel, well, that's going to be the end of this guy. And maybe you knew he was a pretty good hitting pitcher.
He was a pretty good hitting, but nobody thought he would actually turn himself into a serviceable outfielder who I believe led the league in assists from the outfield.
That would make sense, right?
Because he had a cannon, obviously, but he hit like 20 plus homers in a season one year.
So, he had, for his career, 1,039 batters faced, all in those early years of his career, because he never took the mound again, and he had 2,100 plate appearances. That's just really impressive to make that switch and do it. You can't think of too many guys.
In the modern era.
Yes.
That's what, so you have to remember, Ankiel's doing that in an era where he faces relief pitchers, and we've already kind of explained how that does make a difference.
Right. So, other guys, you might have remembered Jason Lane. I remember the name when I saw that, and I knew he did a little pitching, and it turned out that he, was not a very good pitcher, but he had a spot start for, oddly enough, Ian Kennedy, who is pitching for the Phillies now as their closer, and he went 6 innings, allowed only 1 run, and then never played as a pitcher again.
No, he got 3 games.
Oh, 3 games, right.
He got 3, but it's just interesting that he was good enough. He must have pitched recently enough before getting to the majors, because it's like we see position players go up on the mound sometimes, and it is baffling to me that sometimes they're like, oh, yes, and this guy was a former pitcher in college. And then you watch his motion, and you're like, no, he wasn't. That man looks like he has no idea how to throw a pitch.
So Red Sox fans might remember Johnny O'Brien. I did not know anything about this guy, and he played in the mid-50s, second baseman, shortstop, and he converted to pitcher after his field play. Now, that's really interesting.
You don't see a lot of guys that do like a lot of guys do that in the minors.
Right.
The best pitcher in baseball did that.
Right.
People don't know that. I mean, the Mets broadcast talk about it all the time, but DeGrom was a shortstop in the minors, and they're like, let's
Stetson.
Let's try him
in
at
college. Yeah.
Let's try him at pitcher, and they're like, oh, he should be a pitcher.
So Johnny O'Brien doesn't start pitching until he's in his mid-30s, and I just think that's really interesting. And I think we talked about in the podcast. I remember the Braves had a second baseman named Mark Lemke, who played on their playoff teams, and he went back to the minor leagues when his hitting prowess went enough that he couldn't do anything to hide the fact that he couldn't hit at all, and his glove wasn't enough. He started learning a knuckleball to try to make it back to the major leagues. I think he got as far as AAA.
I think the problem is if you're at the point where you're learning a knuckleball, you've kind of already admitted defeat.
Yeah. Maybe we should do. We haven't done an episode on the knuckleball itself.
An episode in the history of the knuckleball could be interesting.
Because I don't know there's anybody in the major leagues throwing it right now. I think somebody just was trying to.
Stephen Wright was the only one that was floating
recently
around, but there's usually one somewhere in the majors. But I think another interesting guy to talk about before I think we should probably finish up with Ohtani in some respects at some point, just because talking about what he's doing. But an interesting guy to me is Michael Lorenzen of the Reds, because he was a modern guy who was a pitcher.
He's still playing.
He's still pitching, but they try to give him some at bats, and it's tough to tell whether it was like the same way the other day they had a pitcher do pinch hitting for somebody.
Yes.
It was just recently they were sending up a pitcher to do pinch hitting, and he got like a double. Was it Fried?
Yes, it was. It was Max Fried.
Yeah. Because he's just the guy can actually hit. So with Lorenzen, I'm like, he has 53 career. In 2019, he got 53 plate appearances. Was this just like he's actually the best bat we have left on the bench?
He's not pinch hitting 53 times, I don't think.
No.
So, but I don't know that he played the field either.
So my guess is that between pitching
and his pinch hitting,
occasionally pinch hitting, but he had 7 home runs in those 53 plate appearances. That's pretty good.
Yeah, exactly. So he's kind of between. He's still, I think, thought of it. He actually has some saves to his credit as well. 11 saves in his career and 22 wins, and he's got home runs. So that's kind of an interesting.
Yeah, not a lot of guys will have all 3 of those things.
So a Hall of Famer that I love talking about this guy, and I think I've mentioned him before because he had the all-time season record for hits in a season before Ichiro broke it.
Okay, George Sisler.
Is George Sisler. And he somehow, I had no idea, he pitched to 453 major league hitters. Okay, so that's like, okay, and he didn't start games, I think because it was a relief pitcher. And, he played at a time where, we said this before, where guys did that, but he had 9,000 plate appearances, 2,800 hits, and he pitched to 453 hitters. This is the
only thing I can think it was probably more common back then when a guy like George Sisler was playing to, show up at the ballpark and have the manager go, whoops, pitcher can't go today. We need somebody to pitch.
Right.
That could actually happen back then because you might only have like 2 pitchers on your staff.
Right. And the later it goes, the less likely this was to happen.
Less likely that a random position player is going to get forced into actually having to pitch.
So for Yankee fans, we'll throw out Johnny Lindell, and again, another guy I barely new. So he played from 1941 to 54, had 3,123 plate appearances. That's a career.
That's a meaningful number.
And 1,141 batters faced. So now we got a guy with over 1,000 batters and did most of his pitching also at the end of his career. So doesn't pitch, and then in the last 2 years of his career, he does almost all of his pitching, and they bring him back.
It's impressive that he could face that many batters,
right? In 2 seasons,
he must have been pitching a little bit throughout the rest of his career.
No, I think it was almost exclusively in those 2 years.
I'm just impressed that he could face 1,100 batters in 2 seasons.
Right. Well, he pitched. He was exclusively a pitcher and was not really doing very much hitting at that point.
He must have been pitching a lot. That's all I'm saying.
So, but the weird thing is, right? So he pitches in those 2 seasons, 53 and 54, at the end of his career, and then he comes back and in 54, and he has 7 pinch hit appearances. So they're not going to play him in the field, but he's still a good enough hitter to pinch hit, even though he's primarily pitching.
It almost sounds like the start of a retirement tour that they ended. They're like, oh, you know what, you're doing it. We'll give him a couple extra.
And it's not like the Yankees weren't good during this period.
They were.
They were a good team. So kind of interesting that he did that. And I guess the last guy we'll throw out there is a guy who played for a bunch of teams, including the Yankees and the Senators and the Red Sox. A guy named Ben Chapman.
Never heard of him.
Me neither. He played 17 years in the major leagues, career 302 hitter, and again, he only pitched in the last 3 years of his career.
But this is what I'm saying. So this is why I think Johnny Lindell had to be pitching before 53, is because Chapman was pitching in 44, 45, and 46, and he only faced 642 batters in those 3 seasons. Whereas Lindell, as far as I can tell, only pitched in 53, but faced 1,100 batters. I don't think that's possible.
He pitched a little before that. I didn't think he had pitched very much.
Yeah,
Maybe you're right. We should go back and check that.
But I think what it's more is that he became a full-time pitcher in that 53 season.
Right. That's what he was. And much the same as Ben Chapman, who, has a pretty nice career with a career WAR of 42.8.
302 hitter.
Yeah, so, I guess he'd be an almost guy in our book because you'd have to look at it going, does it make a guy more interesting as a Hall of Fame candidate? Yeah, I think so too. I think you have to look at guys like that going, that's kind of special. And it wasn't probably thought of nearly as much as like Ohtani. Okay, he's got 559 batters faced through right now. If he just pitches for another 2 or 3 years and then becomes exclusively a hitter, I think that puts him in. If he has a pretty good hitting career, he's done something that nobody's doing.
I think that's the thing. That's what makes Ohtani so special, is that he is being good at both.
And he's doing so. Wouldn't it be cool if Ohtani did that? And so he didn't pitch for a bunch of years and he hit. And then he's 35 years old going, well, I can't really hit anymore. I'll go back to pitching.
And he's this crafty older pitcher.
Exactly.
Never lost it. That'd be great. It would be amazing. That's what movies are made of.
Yeah.
That he still has it in him, that he's just that good a player.
I really like that you feel like I do, that it makes a player more interesting than the can. And some of the, because when you do career WAR, I don't know if you throw pitching WAR on top of hitting WAR.
That's the fun part about it, though. Nobody knows, because there's only really one guy we've ever had to consider it for.
Right. In recent years, certainly. Since
in general, really, Ruth is the only guy you have to put a lot of consideration into how their pitching WAR and batting WAR.
I'll have to go and check the records and see if Ruth's career crazy high WAR includes his pitching WAR on top of his hitting WAR, or if it's just one or
somebody out there could probably answer that for us too.
Wouldn't be that hard for us.
And sort of like on another note, now that we're kind of coming down to the end of the Olympics here, we thought it would be appropriate, considering we did mention the Olympics briefly in a previous episode, to just talk about the end of the baseball, because we will not be seeing it in 2024.
Right. The Olympics, Japan, since they're the host nation, wanted both softball and baseball in the Olympics, and in baseball, the men have not traditionally done very well in the Olympics, per se.
Now, granted, this is in part because, unlike a lot of the other, we don't play football in the Olympics, but I don't think anybody really needs to see that. But in basketball and hockey, those two sports basically let their players go and play just because of the timing and the importance of it. Baseball, none of the major leaguers, Shohei Ohtani didn't go play for Japan. None of the American players went and go play. Nobody went and go played for their country. So you're not really getting necessarily the same representation that you get in some of the other sports.
I was advocating that. I think women's softball, and by the way, I'm a fan of softball. I watched a lot of the NCAA softball tournament this year, and it's really interesting and exciting to watch, because the best players, ostensibly, because there's not a women's really,
They all
big professional league. The best players play softball both at the Olympics, and it means everything. And the United States, fields one of the strongest teams, did not win the gold medal in the Olympics here. And the men, surprisingly, with a bunch of guys, Todd Frazier and a bunch of guys you probably haven't heard of, Tyler Austin, and folks like that, got all the way to the gold medal game against the host nation, Japan. And then they went all Mets on our nation.
It's called not getting any hits, leaving a bunch of guys on base, and not scoring.
A 1-0 game.
I think it was 2.
It was.
I think we finished 2-0.
They got another.
They got another
game. Right? They got another game in the run in the 8th inning. You're right. And great for Japan, right? It's the first gold medal Japan has won in baseball, and they did it unfortunately in front of very few fans.
But I'm sure, knowing how important baseball is there, I'm sure that was a huge, and to have that happening the same year Ohtani's going crazy in the majors, that's such a boost to Japanese baseball.
And American fans really missed out on actually, had those stands been full of fans with Japan winning the gold medal, the way they chant, the way they cheer, the way they root for their teams in Japan and their players,
the
would have been so fun.
The fan experience in Japan and Korea, in terms of the audience participation, is so much better than what we have in America. Like, the best thing I could think about the American fans recently was when the Dodger fans were mercilessly doing the wave while there was some batter from the other team lying on the ground with an injury. You see the guy like lying on the ground after he gets hurt, and then you just see the Dodgers and the fans in the background doing the wave without a care in the world.
So that brings up really a question, and particularly regarding baseball, right? You talked about basketball, which is not during its season, and
Chris Middleton and Drew Holiday showed up halfway through, but that was about it.
Well, they showed up halfway through, and they made the difference.
Becoming some of very few players to win the NBA title.
Right.
There's only 6 of them, and 2 of them are teammates.
Yeah, it reminded me of Kenny Morrow winning the Stanley Cup after he had won the Olympic gold medal in 1980. And so, the basketball isn't played during season. Hockey is played the Winter Olympics. During the hockey season, they actually take a break for the Olympics because the players want to play. When we have the World Baseball Classic in baseball, which is, I don't know how well it's received, but it's interesting, and it happens in March most of the time before the season, at the beginning of spring training. What about, here's my question to you, what about the Olympics not playing the baseball Olympics during the Olympics and playing it after the season or at another time when more of the players could actually participate and make it a more interesting tournament?
Baseball needs to pick. And what I mean by that is, so in soccer, football, for most of the rest of the world and not America, winning the Olympic gold medal is a big deal. But it's
not the World Cup.
It's not the World Cup. And so when the World Cup comes around every 4 years, all the soccer.
Everything stops.
Everything stops. All soccer across the world stops. Baseball kind of wants to have it both ways, where they're like, oh, we're going to put the World Baseball Classic before the season, which just makes all the fans of the major league teams go, I don't like this. I don't want my very important player to get hurt before the season in what they deem as a meaningless game, because not everybody participates. So I think if baseball really wants to do, if baseball is no longer going to be part of the Olympics, every 4 years, you shut down during July and you do the World Baseball Classic. You want to make it into an event like the World Cup. You want people to treat your big world, because like right now, the World Baseball Classic is a sideshow at best. People don't take it that seriously because players can just opt out.
Well, and doing it in March, right? I always think about the pitchers, right? I remember Seth Lugo pitched really well for Puerto Rico in the World Baseball Classic. That sort of set him on the course of being a major league pitcher of note when people saw what he did in the World Baseball Classic. But if it's in the middle of the season, are you really going to throw Ohtani or DeGrom out there in the middle of July in a tournament that doesn't help your team win the World Series?
The clubs might not. But do the players want to? What will the players care more about? Because the reason I think it works in hockey is because hockey is such an international sport already. There's so many people playing.
So why are hockey players willing to risk injury during the season and baseball players not?
Because the country pride matters so much more, because the league makeup is a lot more diverse. So you've got a lot more people playing hockey professionally in the NHL from all over the world, whereas it's less diverse in baseball. So proving yourself in baseball is still more important than proving your country in baseball, I think.
You might have a point. I like the idea of taking every 4 years and finding a time to play the World Baseball Classic. And you know what? So if you're going to throw your better pitchers or your best pitchers out there, maybe they're going to only pitch 1 or 2 or 3 innings in these games. That's okay.
Let's put it this way. All those soccer players or all those football players are going out and risking injury during the World Cup. I don't hear any fan going, well, what happens if Messi gets injured and he can't play for Real Madrid or whoever he's playing for? Nobody cares about that.
Right.
World Cup supersedes that.
If you're the Brooklyn Nets and you're watching Kevin Durant go nuts in the Olympics, you think, gee, that's great. Please don't get hurt.
The only thing I can think watching Kevin Durant in the Olympics is, wow, this is the Olympics filled with some of the best basketball players from across the NBA. And Kevin Durant is unquestionably the best one out of all of them.
Yeah, all the other guys look back and go, wow, he does things that I just can't imagine.
Just watch him. It is incredible how good
It'll be harder to do that in baseball, right? To have that kind of dominance.
To just be like so much noticeably better than your peers. And watching KD, you get that. You're like, it looks so easy for him.
It would be like Ohtani going into the World Baseball Classic and hitting 11 home runs.
Batting 450 and throwing 3 complete game shutouts.
Exactly.
And you're just like, he's just on a different plane.
Yeah, so
which maybe he is.
I would like to see women's softball actually be a permanent part of the Olympics. I think there's value in that.
Because
way
in
above.
that, I think because what you see in women's Olympics is that's your chance to strut your stuff. Because the World Series title has so much more importance than the Olympic gold medal or the World Baseball Classic, players don't value it. But if you make it into more of it might not happen the first year. The first year you do that mid-season World Baseball Classic, you might not get the reception you want. But you don't have 100+ years of history doing it that way like the World Cup does. But you keep doing it, people will treat it that way.
And now, last point on this. So the softball, there are two-way players, right? Because the pitchers often hit in college softball.
They're some of the best
they're
players
really
on the team.
good. So you get to see two-way players there in a way that you don't at the major league.
Yeah, and if we tried to track softball pitchers and played a batter's
everybody,
because they also pitch to literally every batter, so it would be
every game.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at Almost Cool.